In Dorian Vance's world, that dog was worth more than a human life trained never to leave his side, never to break a single command. Yet that night, in the tallest financial tower in Chicago, it did the one thing it had never done. It abandoned its place beside the most powerful man in the city. It crossed a corridor full of stunned workers holding their breath, and it stopped before a woman kneeling to scrub the floor in a darkened corner, a widow with a crippled leg, someone this world had never once bothered to look at. Dorian Vance stood frozen, watching his most loyal companion press its head into the trembling hand of a stranger. And for the first time in years of cold detachment, something in his chest stirred. They say animals see what people choose to ignore. Tonight, what had that dog seen in the woman no one cared to notice? If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more healing stories ahead. The 40th floor of Vance Tower was submerged in the cold glow of recessed lights, casting a steel blue sheen across the glass. Outside, the whole city of Chicago stretched out like a silent ocean of lights, but inside that vast office, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Dorian Vance sat behind the dark walnut desk, his hands folded together, his gaze so calm it sent a chill down the spine of the man standing before him. In front of him, a man named Garrett Boyd stood rigid, sweat beating at his temples despite the cool air conditioning in the room. Garrett had been his right hand for 7 years, the man he had trusted with the most important numbers. Tonight, those very numbers had exposed him. Dorian said nothing for a long while. He only turned over a sheet of paper on the desk, his eyes moving across the lines of figures someone had skillfully altered, sums of money that had flowed through 3 intermediary accounts before vanishing into thin air. Garrett opened his mouth to explain himself, his voice trembling as he said it was only an accounting error, that he would clarify everything within the next few days. Dorian looked up, and that single look was enough to make Garrett's words die in his throat. He didn't shout. In Dorian Vance's world, the man who had to raise his voice was the man who had already lost his power. He reached for the phone, dialed a familiar number, and spoke in an even tone, as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. He told the person on the other end of the line to freeze all of Garrett's access, revoke every signature authority, and send someone to clear out his desk before dawn. That was all. A call lasting less than a minute, and the entire career Garrett had built over the past 7 years collapsed neatly, like a building being dismantled from the inside. Garrett went pale, stammering as he begged, saying he had a wife and children, that he had debts to pay. Dorian stood, came around the desk, and stopped 1 step away from him. He said softly that he wasn't punishing him because he was poor or because he was greedy, but because he had betrayed trust, and more importantly, because he hadn't acted alone. That sentence left Garrett frozen, because they both understood that the missing money was too large, too carefully concealed, for him to have arranged it by himself. Behind Garrett was someone else, a faceless shadow that had slipped deep into Dorian's empire long ago, using men like Garrett as a shield. Dorian had sensed that person's presence for many months, in every crooked stream of money, every murky contract, every name that appeared and disappeared like smoke. Tonight, he hadn't come to this tower because of Garrett. Garrett was only the loose thread he had pulled in order to reach the real ball of yarn. He had come here to examine everything from the root, to find the final name standing behind it all. Garrett was silently led outside by 2 men, without handcuffs, without shoving, only a smooth escort that, in Dorian's world, was more frightening than any threat. When the door closed, only he and Titan remained in the room. The dog lay at the foot of the desk, as massive as a dark block of stone, his deep brown eyes following every movement of his master. Dorian bent down, placed a hand on its wrinkled head, and for the first time all evening, his expression softened a little. He was tired, not with the fatigue of the body, but with the weariness that had settled like sediment in his heart over many years, the weariness of a man standing at the very top while surrounded only by people waiting for the chance to stab him in the back. He glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. The files he needed were still down in the records room on the floor below, and he wanted to review them with his own hands before giving them to anyone else. Dorian put on his dark overcoat and signaled to Titan. The dog rose at once, staying close at his heels like a shadow. Master and dog stepped into the elevator. The metal doors slid shut, and the elevator car began to descend toward the lower floors, where the lights were no longer elegant, but only the cold white glare of the service area. Dorian had no idea that in just a few more minutes, in a place where he had never set foot before, something he could never have foreseen was waiting for him. On the 18th floor of that tower, where the lights no longer carried the proud elegance of the upper class, but only a pale white glare shining down over empty corridors, Maren Caldwell pushed her floor-cleaning cart along the glass wall. She was 28 years old, but her limping gait and sagging shoulders made her look as though she had carried an entire lifetime on her back. Her left leg had been aching dully since the beginning of her shift, a familiar pain creeping up from her ankle to her knee whenever the weather turned cold, the remnant of an old injury that had never been properly treated because she didn't have the money. She had learned how to live with it, how to shift her weight onto her right leg, how to grit her teeth each time she had to kneel down and scrub at a stubborn stain. Maren was a widow. That was all people in this building knew about her, and most of them didn't even bother knowing that much. She was the woman carrying a mountain of debt on her shoulders, working the night shift because it paid a few dollars more, and because during the day she still took on other jobs. Every night she came here when the rest of the city was preparing to sleep, quietly wiping the panes of glass that by day reflected the images of people in expensive suits, scrubbing the marble floors, their polished shoes stepped across without once looking back at the person who had made them shine. That invisibility, strangely enough, was something Maren felt grateful for. When people didn't see you, they also didn't pity you, didn't offer hollow words of comfort that only made her feel even smaller. She'd rather be a quiet shadow than become some pitiful story in someone else's mouth. She cleaned floors not because she loved the work, but because it was the only thing left that helped her stay on her feet, in both the literal and the deeper sense. Tonight, just as Maren had finished mopping one corner of the hallway and was holding on to the cart handle to straighten her back, Roland Pike's shrill voice sounded behind her. Pike was the night shift manager, an average-sized man with a swollen belly and a habit of finding pleasure in tormenting those weaker than himself. He walked toward her with the timesheet in his hand, his lips curling into a bland, unpleasant smile. He said she had cleaned the main lobby too slowly last night, that a guest had complained about a watermark on the floor, and that he would have to dock her pay this week. Maren knew perfectly well there had been no guest complaint. Knew perfectly well that the watermark had been splashed there by Pike's own lackey after she had already finished cleaning. But she didn't argue. She had learned that arguing with Pike only made things worse, that with men like him, resistance from someone powerless was only seasoning that made his little entertainment more satisfying. She only lowered her head and said softly that she would be more careful. But Pike wasn't finished. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into something slick and filthy, reminding her that there was a long line of people waiting for this job, that a crippled woman like her was lucky he had kept her on at all, and that if she made one more mistake, he would throw her out onto the street at once, without any notice. Maren felt her face burn, not from shame, but from a quiet anger rising in her chest, the kind of anger she had grown far too used to swallowing. She tightened her grip around the handle of the cleaning cart until her knuckles turned white, but she didn't say a word. She thought about the debt, about the bills stacked on the kitchen table of her cramped apartment, and she stayed silent. Pike snorted in triumph, tossed back a final remark that he would be keeping an eye on her, then turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the empty corridor. Maren drew in a deep breath, blinked away the hot sting threatening to rise in her eyes, then bent down again and continued her work. She didn't know that at that very moment, in another corner of the tower, an elevator car was silently descending toward her floor, carrying the thing that was about to change everything. When the elevator doors slid open on the 18th floor, Maren was still kneeling in the corner of the corridor, wiping up a coffee stain someone had spilled and abandoned since the afternoon shift. She didn't look up. The sound of heavy, slow footsteps echoed across the stone floor, and then the whole atmosphere shifted. A sudden thick silence that even the back of her neck could feel. The night shift workers nearby froze. Some hurriedly pressed themselves against the wall, while others pretended to be busy so they wouldn't have to lift their eyes, because the man who had just stepped out of the elevator wasn't someone people dared to look at directly. Dorian Vance walked down the corridor with the bearing of a man who had never once had to step aside for anyone, and beside him was the dog, massive as a moving block of darkness, with a broad chest, a wrinkled head, and dark eyes fixed straight ahead. The workers scattered, not out of respect, but out of instinctive fear, the feeling of standing too close to a kind of power they couldn't understand. And yet, in the middle of that moment, the dog suddenly stopped. Dorian had taken a few more steps before he realized the leash in his hand had pulled tight. He turned back, his brow faintly furrowing. In the 7 years since the animal had come to him, Titan had never once left his side by so much as half a step without a command. Yet now it stood rooted in place, its nose lifting as it sniffed the air, then turned its head toward the corner of the corridor, where the cleaning woman was bent over her work. Dorian called its name softly, his voice low and firm, the kind of voice that only needed to be spoken for even the most stubborn men to obey. Titan didn't move. Then, under the stunned eyes of everyone there, the dog pulled the leash taut and walked straight toward Marin, each step slow and certain, as though it had chosen that path a very long time ago. Marin looked up when the enormous shadow fell over her. An animal that large was enough to make anyone step back, and yet she didn't shrink away. Perhaps she was simply too exhausted to know fear anymore. Or perhaps in the dog's deep brown eyes, she didn't see savagery, but something else. Something painfully close to herself. She sat still, the cleaning rag still in her hand, and quietly looked at it. The dog took one more step, then lowered its great head and pressed close to her dangling hand. Marin gave a slight start at that sudden warmth, but she didn't pull away. She only opened her palm and let the animal's wrinkled forehead rest against it, and something inside her chest seemed to loosen, a feeling she hadn't touched in a very long time, the feeling of being sought out by another living creature, not out of pity, but simply to be near. The whole corridor held its breath. One worker whispered whether they should call security, but no one dared to move. Dorian stood motionless a few steps away, his gaze shifting from the dog to the woman, then remaining there. He was used to watching people react to Titan with terror. He was used to seeing even men who called themselves hard and fearless turn pale and back away. But this woman was different. She didn't beg, didn't panic, didn't even lift her eyes to him in search of rescue. She only sat there, quietly touching the animal as if the two of them understood something no one standing around them could ever understand. Dorian called Titan again, and this time his voice held less command, carrying instead a faint trace of confusion he rarely allowed anyone to see. The dog still wouldn't leave. It leaned into the hand of the strange woman, steady as an anchor sunk into the bottom of the sea, and for the first time in many years, Dorian Vance found himself unable to predict what would happen next. After a moment of stunned silence, Marin lightly patted the dog's neck, then tried to brace one hand against the floor and kneel back down to the unfinished coffee stain, because whatever strange thing was happening, her shift still wasn't over, and Roland Pike was still lurking somewhere, waiting for a reason to find fault with her. But the moment she shifted, putting her weight onto her knee, Titan immediately turned, placing his enormous body across her path and blocking her from bending any lower. The dog didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It simply stood there like a living wall, its heavy head pressing against her shoulder, forcing her to sit upright. Marin stared in bewilderment and gently tried to push it away, but the animal was steady as stone. It was in that very moment, as she struggled, that her face briefly tightened, a quick flinch at the corner of her mouth as pain shot through her left leg. She hid it at once, pretending nothing had happened, but it was already too late. Dorian, who had spent his whole life reading what other people tried to conceal, had seen it. He stepped closer, his gaze moving from the dog down to the leg she was holding out at an unnatural angle, then to the fingers gripping the edge of the cleaning cart for support. He understood at once that his animal had sensed what no one else in that corridor had bothered to notice, that the woman kneeling there to scrub the floor was enduring a pain she had buried behind a stubborn face. Dorian spoke, his voice low and calm, asking if she was all right. Marin looked up at him, and instead of the frightened, submissive look he was used to seeing, her eyes shone with a hard-edged wariness. She said she was fine, that she was only doing her job, and that if he needed to pass, she would move out of the way. That blunt answer made Dorian's brow draw together slightly. Not because he was offended, but because he was surprised. He said his dog didn't do things like this for no reason, that it was trying to stop her from kneeling down. Marin let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh that held no happiness at all, then said perhaps his dog was wiser than its master, but unfortunately, that wisdom couldn't pay her rent. She tried again to push the animal aside so she could stand, but her leg refused to obey, and she staggered. Dorian instinctively reached out, but he stopped halfway when he saw her eyes harden at once, a silent warning that she didn't need to be helped up. He withdrew his hand and let her hold on to the cart handle and rise by herself, little by little, with a stubborn dignity that made it impossible for him to look away. Once she was steady on her feet, Marin exhaled, then looked straight at him and asked who he was, coming all the way down to a floor no one cared to visit at such a late hour. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He looked at the woman before him, at the hurriedly tied hair with a few loose strands falling free, at the faded janitor's uniform, at the leg she was trying so hard to hide was hurting, and most of all, at those eyes, the eyes of someone who had lost so much that she had nothing left to fear. He realized he was standing before something very rare in his world, a human being who hadn't been conquered, even though life had done everything it could to break her. He quietly answered that he was only someone who happened to be passing by, then bent down and patted Titan's back, signaling for it to return to his side. This time the dog obeyed, but it walked slowly, looking back at the woman every few steps, as if it had never truly wanted to leave. And as Dorian turned away, he realized that he, too, was lingering in much the same way. Dorian hadn't gone far when the sound of hurried shoes struck the end of the corridor, and Roland Pike appeared, his face dark with anger, as he saw the workers gathered together and neglecting their duties. He didn't recognize the man in the dark overcoat standing there, and he didn't even bother noticing the enormous dog beside him, because in his mind at that moment there was only irritation and the old habit of taking his anger out on the weakest person nearby. He strode straight toward Marin and shouted that she was dragging her feet again, that who did she think she was, standing around chatting during working hours. Marin opened her mouth to explain that she hadn't been chatting at all, but Pike didn't give her the chance. He snatched the cleaning rag from her hand and flung it onto the floor, then unleashed a string of cruel words, calling her useless, a burden, saying that a limping woman who dragged herself around like her should have been grateful he still gave her the charity of this job. He said he was sick of having to remind her that first thing tomorrow morning he would draw up the paperwork to throw her out onto the street. And this time no one would be able to save her. Marin stood still, her chin trembling slightly, but she didn't lower her head, didn't shed a single tear in front of him, only clenched both hands tight so he wouldn't see how deeply she was hurt. Through that entire scene, Dorian didn't say a word. He only stood motionless in the shadow of the corridor, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, watching in silence, and his face grew colder by the second, like the surface of a lake freezing over. Only when Pike had finished did Dorian slowly step out of the darkness, the white light falling across his face, calm in a way that made the blood run cold. He spoke, not loudly, not quickly, only in an even voice, as if he were reading a sentence, asking Pike what he had just said to this woman. Pike spun around, at first ready to snap at the person who dared interfere, but when he met Dorian's eyes, a vague fear suddenly slipped down his spine, though he didn't yet understand why. He stammered and asked who he was. Dorian didn't answer that question. He took out his phone, dialed a number, and in that deadly calm voice, told the person on the other end that he wanted to know immediately who was responsible for the cleaning contract and night shift personnel at Vance Tower. The moment the name of the tower left his mouth, Pike felt both his legs go weak. Dorian listened to the answer, then continued calmly, saying that this man named Roland Pike had just insulted and threatened an employee inside his building, that he wanted Pike's contract terminated from this very moment, every authority revoked, and his access card deactivated before he could reach the parking lot. Pike froze where he stood, his face drained of every drop of color, stammering that there must have been some mistake, that he hadn't known, that he was only doing his duty. Dorian cut him off, his voice still never rising, and it was precisely that composure that frightened people most. He said the duty of a manager wasn't to trample those under his authority, and that any man who found pleasure in bullying the powerless didn't deserve to hold any kind of power, no matter how small. He said that from tonight on, Pike would understand what it felt like to have everything stripped away in only a few minutes, exactly the way he had always threatened the people beneath him. Only a few minutes later, 2 building security officers arrived and stood silently on either side of Pike. There was no shoving, no raised voice, but the way they escorted him away was colder than any act of roughness. Pike looked back at Marin, his eyes filled with both terror and a plea for rescue, but she only watched in silence, neither satisfied nor pitying. When his shadow disappeared behind the door, the corridor fell into stillness, and Marin slowly turned to look at the strange man who had overturned her familiar world with only a few sentences. In the silence that still lingered after Pike had been led away, Marin bent down to pick up the cleaning rag he had thrown on the floor, dusted it off, and placed it neatly back on the edge of the cart, as if she were trying to restore a little order to the world that had just been turned upside down. Dorian watched her make those small movements, then spoke, and this time his voice had lost some of the coldness from moments before. He said that a woman like her shouldn't have to endure a man like Pike, that he could arrange a better job for her, an easier one, in a place where no one would ever dare treat her that way again. He added that if she was having trouble with money, he was willing to help, and to him it would hardly mean anything at all. Maren stopped moving. She slowly lifted her eyes to him, and in her gaze there was none of the gratitude he had expected, only a guardedness that had become a habit. She asked who he thought she was, asked whether he believed that by throwing money around, he could rearrange another person's life to suit his own satisfaction. Dorian fell slightly still, because this wasn't a reaction he had ever encountered. In his world, people reached out and accepted before he had even finished speaking. People lowered their heads. They thanked him. They treated his help as if it were a blessing handed down from heaven. And yet this limping woman, in a faded uniform, looked at his kindness as though it were something being offered for sale that she had no wish to buy. She went on, her voice even, but every word firm, saying that she was grateful he had made Pike pay for what he had done, but that was because Pike was wrong, not because she was pitiful. She said she didn't need anyone to hand her a job out of charity, that the work she was doing, no matter how lowly it seemed in the eyes of the world, had still been earned by her own hands and her own sweat, and she would rather keep kneeling to scrub every stretch of this floor than accept a single dollar she hadn't earned herself. She said people could take almost everything from her health, her family, her money. But there was one thing she would never allow anyone to take away, and that was the right to stand on her own 2 feet, even if one of those feet was no longer whole. Dorian went silent. He looked at her for a long time, and in that moment, the man who was used to commanding an entire empire suddenly couldn't find a single word to answer. He had met countless strong people who believed themselves hard and unbreakable, but most of them collapsed the moment he placed a large enough number on the table. This woman, who had nothing in her hands, stood before him with something his money couldn't buy and his power couldn't bend. He quietly asked whether she knew who he was, not to threaten her, but because he was curious whether her attitude would change if she truly understood the man standing in front of her. Maren answered that she didn't need to know, that to her he was a stranger who had happened to be kind tonight, and tomorrow she might never see him again, so who he was didn't matter. She bent down and took hold of the handle of the cleaning cart, ready to push it onward, but before turning away, she paused and added softly that if he truly wanted to do something good, he should remember that not every poor person needed pity. Some people only needed to be seen as human. Then she pushed the cart away, her limping figure gradually disappearing at the end of the corridor, leaving Dorian standing there with the dog at his feet, and a strange feeling he had forgotten a very long time ago, the feeling of having just met someone who made him look back at himself. Maren's final words that night clung to Dorian for many days afterward. He, a man long accustomed to forgetting the faces of those who begged him, couldn't drive from his mind the image of the limping woman pushing her cleaning cart down the corridor and disappearing without once reaching for the thing this entire city longed to receive from his hand. He wasn't used to being refused. But what troubled him wasn't the refusal itself. It was the way she refused him, with a dignity that he himself, amid all his money and power, had lost a long time ago. Instead of ordering people to investigate her the way he usually did with anyone who came under his attention, Dorian quietly learned only enough to know that her name was Maren Caldwell, that she worked 2 jobs at once, and that she was carrying a hospital debt from the old days. He stopped there and went no deeper, because some part of him understood that the woman would see having her private life dug through as an insult, even heavier than poverty itself. What Maren didn't know was that a few days later, the burden on her painful leg was mysteriously eased. Her shift was moved to an area where she had to kneel less often. The heaviest tasks were suddenly taken over by someone else, and the new manager who replaced Pike was polite and fair, never once raising his voice. Maren thought it was luck, or perhaps some new building policy, and she never suspected that behind those quiet changes was a hand arranging things in silence, a hand that had deliberately left no trace so she wouldn't feel indebted to anyone. Dorian did all of it from the shadows, without a message, without any showy gift, because he had learned from her that true kindness didn't need to announce itself in order to be credited. Some nights, he still went down to the lower floors, using the excuse of checking the building's operations, only to see her working from a distance and reassure himself that she was all right. Titan always went with him, and strangely, that dog, who was usually silent and indifferent toward the whole world, would prick up its ears each time it heard Marin's limping footsteps, pulling the leash tight in her direction. One night, as he stood silently at the end of the corridor and watched, one of his trusted bodyguards who had come with him blurted out a question, asking why his boss cared so much about a cleaning woman. Dorian was quiet for a long while, then only answered softly that there were people who reminded him of something he had lost a very long time ago. He didn't say what that thing was, and the bodyguard was wise enough not to ask further. But in that moment, Dorian's eyes, usually sharp as steel, suddenly sank with the shadow of an old pain he had buried carefully beneath layer after layer of power and coldness. Because the injustice Marin was carrying, the sight of a vulnerable person being trampled by those stronger than her while no one cared enough to look, touched the deepest wound inside him, the wound he had spent his whole life trying to fill by punishing those who bullied others. He watched Marin work with quiet diligence, watched the way she endured in silence without ever collapsing, and in her he saw a resilience that filled him with both admiration and sorrow. For the first time, after so many years of living in a world made only of calculation and betrayal, Dorian Vance found himself wanting to protect something, not for profit, not for power, but simply because it deserved to be protected. He didn't yet know that this quiet concern would soon pull them both into a storm neither of them could have foreseen, a storm that had been gathering for a long time beneath old secrets, waiting for the day they would rise into the light. One night, later than usual, when the tower was almost entirely empty, Dorian remained in his office with Titan lying at his feet, and for the first time, he allowed the memory he had kept buried so tightly to rise to the surface. This dog had never truly been his. It had once belonged to his younger sister, Cora, a gentle and fragile girl, the only person in his life who had never looked at him with fear in her eyes. Cora had been born with one leg that was not whole, just like Marin, and she had to lean on crutches in order to walk. Their entire childhood had been a long chain of days in which Dorian shielded his sister from cruel laughter, from contemptuous looks, from stronger people who were always looking for ways to corner a little girl who couldn't defend herself. He had sworn that he would always be there to protect her, but then life drew him into another world, a world of money and power. And during the years when he was obsessed with climbing to the very top, Cora was left behind, alone. When she was 26 years old, she fell ill. And because there wasn't enough money to get her treated in time, because a hospital turned her away for lacking the proper guarantee papers, she passed quietly before Dorian could make it back to her bedside. When he arrived, all he found was an empty room, and Titan collapsed beside the cold bed, the animal Cora had kept as a companion in her loneliness. The animal that had stayed with his sister in her final hours when it should have been him. From that day on, Dorian took Titan home, and the dog became the only thread still tying him to the sister he had lost, a living reminder of what he had failed to do. He poured all that remorse into punishing those who bullied the powerless, as if every time he struck back, he was atoning for the guilt he carried toward Cora, even though, deep inside, he knew nothing could ever fill that emptiness. And now he understood. He understood why, on that night, Titan, the dog that had never disobeyed a single command in 7 years, had left its place at his side and crossed the entire corridor to find Marin. Because that animal had lived beside Cora long enough to remember something human beings so easily chose to ignore. The limping gait of someone who carried pain in their body, the way a vulnerable person still struggled to stand upright in a world that was always waiting to break them. Titan had smelled in Marin the familiar trace of the old master it had loved so deeply. It had recognized in her the same silent loneliness, the same stubborn dignity Cora had once carried. The dog hadn't chosen Marin by chance. It had gone to her as if finding its way back to a piece of memory it thought it had lost, and when it pressed its heavy head into her trembling hand, perhaps in the simple heart of that animal, it had seen again the shadow of the young woman who used to stroke it every night. Dorian bent down, placed his hand on Titan's wrinkled head, and for the first time in many years, his eyes stung. He whispered to the dog that it had always been wiser than he was, that it had seen what he had nearly missed again. Because if Titan hadn't been there that night, perhaps he would have passed by Marin the way he had passed by thousands of other nameless people, and once again let slip the chance to do what was right, just as he had once let his sister slip away. The dog lifted its head and looked at him with gentle, deep brown eyes, then nestled its head into the palm of his hand. And in that quiet moment, the most powerful man in the city sat there, holding the animal close, carrying in his heart a new resolve that this time, he wouldn't allow the old regret to repeat itself ever again. A few nights later, Dorian went down to the lower floors as he often did, But this time he didn't stand at a distance and watch. He stayed and talked, and slowly, between two people who were both used to keeping their hearts sealed away, a fragile trust began to take root. During a brief break, when Maren sat down on the bench in the corner of the corridor to let her painful leg loosen, Dorian saw her quietly pull a small object from the pocket of her uniform and hold it tightly in her palm, as if it were an unconscious habit. It was an old watch, its glass face cracked by a single line, its leather strap worn thin, something worth very little in money, yet preserved by her as if it were a treasure. He asked softly, and Maren remained silent for a long while before answering, her voice sinking low, that it had belonged to her husband, Daniel, who had died nearly 2 years earlier. She told him in the flat, quiet voice of someone who had cried until there were no tears left, that Daniel had been an electrician, a gentle man who had only wanted to work enough for the two of them to have a small home and a peaceful future. He had taken a job at a large construction site, and on that fateful day, he had been ordered to climb up and handle a wiring system he himself had warned many times was unsafe. A system the contracting company knew perfectly well had problems, but still forced the workers to deal with so they could keep the project on schedule. Maren closed her eyes when she spoke of that moment, the moment she received the call in the middle of the day, the stammering voice on the other end telling her there had been an accident, that Daniel had fallen from above after a failure that should never have been allowed to happen. She said she had run to the hospital with legs that were still whole then, had sat for hours in that stark white hallway waiting in vain, only to receive this watch in the end, the only thing left intact on him, the thing that had kept ticking steadily, while the heart of the man who wore it had stopped beating. Dorian listened in stillness, without interrupting once, because he understood that respectful silence was sometimes worth more than any words of comfort. Maren went on, and this time her voice began to tremble with an indignation she had suppressed for far too long, saying that after Daniel's death, that contracting company had washed its hands clean of every responsibility. They hired the best lawyers, twisted the records, blamed Daniel himself for being careless, and turned an accident they had caused into the fault of the man who was already dead. She had no money to pursue a long lawsuit, no power to stand against an entire corporation, and all she could do was hold her husband's injustice in her arms until she broke beneath it. It was during those exhausted months that she suffered the accident that left her with the damaged leg she had now, and because the little money she had left had already gone into the funeral and the debts her husband had left behind, she couldn't get proper treatment, so she had no choice but to carry that injury with her for the rest of her life. She tightened her hand around the watch and said softly that she didn't keep it to feed her grief, but to remind herself that Daniel had once been a decent man, that he hadn't deserved to die under injustice and have his name stained that way. She said she wanted nothing more than for the truth to come to light one day, so her husband's innocence could be restored, though she knew that for someone in her position, that day would probably never come. Dorian looked at the watch in her hand, then into the eyes of the woman struggling to hold back her tears, and something inside him quietly tightened because her story had awakened a vague instinct in him that he still couldn't name. A few days after that conversation, during a late-night shift, Maren was assigned to clean an empty office on one of the upper floors, where people had recently moved out and left behind a mess of papers that needed to be destroyed. She quietly gathered the stacks of documents into a bin. Most of them were old contracts, invoices, numbers that meant nothing to a cleaning woman like her. But when her hand touched a hard-covered file, her eyes accidentally swept across the name printed on the first page, and her whole body suddenly went rigid. It was the name she would never forget, even if she lived another 100 years. The name of the contracting company that had pushed her husband to his death and then washed its hands of him, the name that had haunted her through every sleepless night for nearly 2 years. Maren stood rooted in the empty room, her hands trembling as she turned page after page, and the more she read, the colder her spine became. These documents weren't ordinary construction contracts. They were tangled money trails, cleverly disguised expenses, transactions flowing from one company to another before circling back to the same point, and the contracting company that had killed her husband was only one small link in that complicated web. She didn't understand all the numbers, but she understood enough to recognize that the corporation that had crushed her life wasn't simply a careless contractor, but a cover for something far larger and much darker. Just then, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, and Maren hurriedly slipped the file inside her coat, her heart pounding, though she herself didn't understand why she was hiding it, instead of dropping it into the destruction bin, as she'd been told. Perhaps it was instinct, Perhaps it was a quiet voice inside her telling her that these pages held part of the truth she had spent so long aching to find. That night, she brought the file back to her small apartment, spread it out beneath the weak yellow light, and stayed awake until dawn, tracing line after line. She didn't know that during those same days, somewhere else inside the tower, Dorian was following that very same network. The faceless traitor he had been hunting for so long had used that exact contracting company as a backroom channel to launder dirty money, turning what seemed like a harmless construction business into a machine for moving funds through hidden transactions. The name that had killed Daniel Caldwell and the name now threatening Dorian Vance's empire turned out to be one and the same. Two people who seemed to come from separate worlds, a widow who cleaned floors and a powerful boss, were walking the same road without knowing it, bound together by the same enemy in the dark. Fate hadn't arranged their meeting by chance. It was evil itself that had silently pulled their lives closer together, an evil that had scattered grief over both of them in different ways. Marin sat among the documents until nearly morning, her heart tangled with 100 thoughts. One part of her wanted to take everything she had found and report it, to finally demand justice for Daniel. But another part of her was afraid, because she understood that people powerful enough to cover up a death and twist the truth were also ruthless enough to silence anyone who dared touch their secrets. She tightened her hand around Daniel's watch, and for the first time after so many months of endurance, a small spark of courage kindled inside her chest, though she didn't yet know that simply keeping that file had unknowingly pushed her into the sight of a dangerous force. During those sleepless nights spent tracing every page of the file, an old memory suddenly came back to life inside Marin, pulling her back to the final days she had spent with Daniel. She remembered that not long before he died, her husband had become unusually quiet, often staying up late to write things down. And once, he had given her a small tin box containing several papers and an old hard drive, telling her to keep it safe and not let anyone know about it, saying it was something that would protect her if anything bad ever happened to him. At the time, Marin had only thought her husband was worrying too much, and after he died, in the deepest agony of her grief, she had placed that box at the bottom of a cabinet and forgotten all about it, never once opening it to see what was inside. Now, as she compared the numbers in the file she had found with the faint memory of what Daniel had once said, a chilling truth slowly took shape in her mind. She sprang to her feet, searched through the bottom of the cabinet, and found the dust-covered tin box. Inside were pages of careful notes, written in her husband's familiar handwriting, photographs of the faulty wiring system the company had deliberately ignored, and recordings of conversations in which supervisors ordered workers to continue the job, even though they knew very well how dangerous it was. Daniel, that gentle electrician, had in fact been quietly gathering evidence of the company's deadly negligence. Perhaps because he had sensed the danger creeping closer to him, he hadn't only left her a watch as a keepsake. He had also left behind something that could expose the crime that had taken his life, something she had unknowingly kept for nearly 2 years, without ever realizing its true value. But what Marin could never have imagined was that at the very same moment she discovered that secret, the hidden enemy on the other side had also begun watching her. For nearly 2 years, no one had cared about the nameless cleaning woman who had been left a widow, because to them, she was only a shadow already crushed and left behind. But from the night Dorian Vance's dog chose her in the corridor, from the moment she entered the attention of the most powerful man in the city, everything had changed. The traitor inside Dorian's empire, who had always watched his every movement, realized that his boss had suddenly developed an unusual interest in a woman who worked the night shift as a cleaner. He sent people to dig into her background, and the name Caldwell appeared like a warning bell. He immediately recognized the deadly connection, that this woman was the widow of the electrician from years before. The electrician they had believed they'd dealt with cleanly, and that if Daniel Caldwell had ever held anything capable of exposing them, then the one person who might still have it was Marin. That fear became even more urgent when his men reported that a sensitive file had disappeared during an office cleanout, and the person assigned to clean that room was none other than her. Every piece locked into place in the traitor's mind, and he understood that the widow who had seemed harmless was now the greatest threat to him, a ticking bomb that could blow apart the entire network he had worked so hard to build. From a shadow no one had bothered to notice, in only a few days, Marin Caldwell had become the name the enemy desperately needed to erase before it was too late, and she stepped into their sights without yet knowing that danger was quietly closing in around her. That hidden traitor, a man named Viktorov Lang, had long been the deepest shadow buried inside Dorian's empire, a man who stood among his trusted circle, while secretly building a private kingdom for himself, out of dirty money. When he realized Maren held in her hands something that could destroy him, Lang didn't rush to use violence, because he understood that one more suspicious death tied to the Caldwell name would only make Dorian, who had already caught his scent, tighten the noose even further. Instead, he devised a far more poisonous move. He would use Maren herself as bait, turning that widow into the string with which he would set a trap to bring Dorian Vance down once and for all. Lang knew his boss's new weakness well. He knew that the cold man had begun to care about the cleaning woman in an unusual way, and he calculated that if Maren were placed in danger, Dorian would certainly come himself, leaving the safe shell of his power behind, only to fall into the trap already waiting for him. He began sending people to follow Maren's every step, recording the hours she went to work, the route she took home, the small apartment where she lived alone. He planted people inside the shift, created situations that seemed accidental in order to push her into isolation, and waited with patient cruelty for the right moment, like a hunter hidden in the dark. But Lang had forgotten one thing, that in this world, very few things could escape Dorian Vance's eyes for long. During those days, Dorian began to feel that something was wrong. His network of eyes and ears reported unusual movements, a few unfamiliar faces appearing around the areas where Maren worked, a few suspicious phone calls, a few small payments made to men who specialized in shadowed work. At first, he couldn't piece everything together, but the instinct of a man who had survived countless schemes wouldn't allow him to ignore it. When he quietly ordered his people to check deeper, each piece slowly emerged, and a cold shiver ran down his spine when he realized that the Caldwell name hadn't appeared in his life by chance. He traced it back and discovered that the contracting company that had killed Maren's husband was the very back channel the traitor had been using, and that the man's interest in the widow was no small matter. His heart tightened when he understood that his own attention toward Maren had unknowingly turned her into a target, that the night Titan chose her had pulled her out of the safety of obscurity and placed her directly on the edge of a war she had never belonged to. Dorian stood beside the glass wall of his office, looking down at the glittering city below, and for the first time in many years, he felt real fear, not for himself, but for another human being. He thought of Cora, thought of the promise from years ago that he had failed to keep, and told himself that this time, he wouldn't let history repeat itself, wouldn't let another vulnerable person pay the price for his delay. He immediately ordered his most trusted people to protect Maren quietly from a distance, while tightening the investigation to drag the traitor into the light before he could make his move. But he understood that time was counting down, that his opponent was cunning and ruthless, and that the storm that had been gathering for so long was about to come crashing down. In the darkness of the city, two forces silently moved toward each other, and caught in the line of fire was a woman who had only wanted to live in peace, now holding in her hands the one thing that could change everything. Viktorov Lang chose to make his move on a rainy night, when Maren's shift ended later than usual, and the tower was almost entirely empty. He had arranged everything carefully, cutting back the schedules of the co-workers around her, disabling several cameras in the parking garage under the excuse of maintenance, and placing his men in the darkness to wait. Maren left the elevator and went down into the basement to head home, the file and Daniel's tin box carefully hidden inside her backpack, because ever since the day she discovered the secret, she no longer dared leave them alone in her apartment. Her painful leg made each of her steps echo through the empty basement, lonely beneath the steady patter of rain outside. She had only walked a short distance when unease suddenly rose inside her, the instinctive feeling of prey realizing it was being watched. She stopped, looked around, and from behind the rows of concrete columns, several shadows quietly separated themselves and moved toward her with steps that were in no hurry, the unhurried calm of men who knew their prey couldn't escape. Maren stepped back, her heart pounding, her injured leg making it impossible for her to run fast, but she didn't beg. She tightened her grip on the strap of her backpack, leaned her back against a column, and asked what they wanted in a voice she struggled to keep steady. One of them gave a faint laugh and said she had taken something that didn't belong to her, and that if she handed it over obediently, things would be easier. Maren understood at once what they wanted, and she also understood that even if she gave it to them, men like these wouldn't allow a witness like her to live in peace. In that desperate moment, she didn't think about pleading. She thought of Daniel, of his warning to keep the box safe, and a familiar stubbornness rose inside her. She answered that she had nothing to hand over to the people who had killed her husband, and that if they wanted to take it, they would have to get past her first. The men lost their patience. They closed in, and Marin fought back hopelessly, swinging her backpack toward them, trying to drag herself toward the emergency exit even though she knew the chance was fragile. But just when there seemed to be no way out, a deep, rough growl echoed across the entire basement, and from the direction of the stairs, a giant black mass came charging forward like a storm. Titan appeared first, the dog launching straight into the middle of the men, fierce and powerful, forcing them to scatter in panic. Right behind him was Dorian Vance, stepping down the last stairs with the bearing of a fury held tightly in check, his eyes in the darkness shining with a deadly coldness. He had managed to uncover Lang's plan in time, had rushed there the moment his watchers reported that Marin had been cornered in the basement, and he had arrived just in time. His appearance made the henchmen freeze, because they recognized that the man who had arrived was none other than the very person they had been ordered to lure out. For a moment, the entire basement seemed to hold its breath beneath the sound of the rain, with the limping woman leaning against the column and gasping for breath on one side, the powerful man and his loyal beast on the other, and Lang's men caught between them, wavering between obedience and fear. Dorian spoke, his voice ringing hard through the damp, cold space, ordering them to let her go immediately if they still wanted to see tomorrow's sun. He said he knew who stood behind them, knew they were only sacrificial pawns, and that if they were wise enough, they would choose the right side on this fateful night. The men glanced at one another in hesitation, but their leader, loyal to Lang and terrified of the consequences if he failed, signaled for the others not to back down. And so the confrontation that both Lang and Dorian had been waiting for so long officially began, right there in that dark basement, where the fate of all of them was about to be decided. The henchmen rushed forward, but they quickly realized they had misjudged the situation. Dorian Vance wasn't a man who only knew how to give orders from behind a desk, and the people who came with him, the ones who had been silently following close ever since he uncovered the plot, had already surged in from the other entrances of the basement. In the chaos of that moment, Titan pinned down the leader, forcing him onto the concrete floor with nothing but the immense weight of his body, while Dorian's men swiftly disabled the others. Dorian himself moved with a terrifying calm, every motion decisive and calculated. He wasn't fighting to satisfy his anger. He was fighting to end it, to extinguish the threat aimed at the woman leaning against the column behind him. Within only a few minutes, the men Lang had sent were completely subdued, sprawled across the floor while the rain continued to murmur faintly from the street outside. But Dorian understood that these henchmen were only the surface, that the man he truly needed to face was still hiding somewhere. Then, from the far end of the basement, a slow round of applause echoed, out of place and filled with mockery. Viktorov Lang stepped out of the darkness, still in his perfectly tailored suit, still wearing the cold smile of a man convinced he always held the winning hand. He said Dorian had certainly not disappointed him, that he had known all along that once the bait was placed properly, the lion would surely leave its den. He boasted that the entire basement had been part of his calculation, that he had prepared for tonight to be the end of Dorian Vance's reign. Dorian didn't flinch. He looked at the traitor with a strange calm, then said softly that Lang was right about one thing. Tonight was indeed the end, but not for him. He said that while Lang had been busy pouring all his effort into setting this trap in the basement, Dorian's loyal people had quietly gathered every piece of evidence on his entire network, every stream of dirty money, every hidden transaction, every name that had joined him in betrayal. He let Lang know that it was his own arrogance, his habit of believing he was always cleverer than everyone else, that had exposed the fatal weakness. While Lang thought he was hunting Dorian, he had in truth been the one guided into the final corner of the board. The smile on Lang's face slowly disappeared when he realized that behind Dorian, at every exit of the basement, Dorian's men had already blocked every way out, and in one man's hand was the stack of documents Lang had believed was still safely buried in the dark. Lang understood that he had lost, not by fists, but by the very schemes he had always taken pride in. In desperation, he tried to lunge toward Marin, the woman he saw as the source of his entire collapse. But Titan blocked him at once, and Dorian's men immediately restrained him before he could get anywhere near her. Lang struggled and screamed cruel words, but it was already too late. Dorian stepped in front of him, bent down, and spoke quietly beside his ear, saying that those who trampled the powerless would always face a day of reckoning. and that an empire built on the blood and tears of innocent people like Daniel Caldwell could never stand for long. He straightened, then ordered his people to hand Lang and all the evidence over to the proper places, so the law, and even the underground forces he had once betrayed, could decide his fate. As Lang was escorted away, he still looked back at Marin with eyes full of hatred, but she only stood there, silent and steady, without turning away. The basement slowly returned to quiet, with only the sound of rain and Marin's uneven breathing left behind. And Dorian turned back toward her, his eyes softening, carrying a silent question about whether she was hurt. The victory that night did not come without a price. During the struggle to protect Marin, Dorian had taken a wound to his side that he hadn't noticed at all amid the tension, and it was only when the basement grew quiet again that Marin realized the fabric at his waist had turned dark. The man who had always stood as steady as a fortress staggered slightly, and this time, he was the one who had to lean on her arm to keep from collapsing. Marin forgot even the pain in her own leg, hurriedly helped him sit down, called for someone to help. And in that moment, the roles between them seemed to reverse. The strongest one now knew pain too, and he too needed a hand to hold him up. Dorian was taken for treatment that very night, and although the wound did not endanger his life, it was still a reminder that he wasn't invincible, that in order to do what was right, sometimes a person had to place even himself along the edge of danger. But the price he paid was not only the wound on his body. To bring Lang down and expose the entire network, Dorian had been forced to bring into the light secrets he himself had once wanted to keep hidden. He had to accept that part of the empire he had built would be cut open beneath the glare of investigation, and he had to sacrifice more than a few interests and hidden alliances he had carefully cultivated over so many years. Some doors of power that had once stood wide open to him now closed, and some who had once feared him now turned wary, because a boss who dared expose rot within his own ranks was, in the eyes of men from the same world, a dangerous and unpredictable boss. Dorian understood those losses clearly, but this time he chose to pay the price without regret, because he knew there were things worth more than power, and returning justice to an innocent man was one of them. In the days that followed, the consequences of that night in the basement spread like a silent earthquake. Viktorov Lang, the man who had once believed he stood above everyone, now faced total collapse. The evidence Daniel Caldwell had left behind, combined with the files Dorian's people had gathered, fully exposed an entire money laundering operation and the crimes that had been hidden for so long. The contracting company that had once washed its hands of Daniel's death, that had twisted the truth and trampled on Marin's pain, was dragged into the light along with Lang. The people at the top were investigated one after another, their assets frozen, and the shining mask they had built over many years shattered in a short time. Those who had once stayed silent out of fear began to speak. Other victims who had been crushed like Daniel slowly became known, and the name that had once spread grief became a symbol of the punishment evil must someday receive. Marin watched all of it with a feeling she couldn't fully describe, both relieved and aching, because even when justice came, it could not bring Daniel back. But she knew that somewhere, perhaps, her late husband could finally close his eyes in peace, now that the truth he had risked his life to preserve had not been buried in darkness after all. She came to Dorian's bedside and sat quietly beside him, and for the first time, she no longer looked at him with the guarded eyes of those early days. She softly thanked him, not only because he had saved her from danger, but because he had believed in the truth she had protected alone for so long, because he had been willing to pay such a costly price for a stranger who shared neither blood nor family with him. Dorian looked at her and quietly answered that she had never been a stranger, that perhaps from the very night Titan chose her, fate had already arranged for two wounded people to find each other in the vast sea of humanity. As the investigation moved deeper into the evidence that had been brought to light, a truth even more bitter than anything Marin had ever imagined gradually emerged. Daniel's death had not simply been the result of negligence, as she had believed for so long. The records showed that even before the day he had the accident, the contracting company had known Daniel was quietly collecting evidence of their violations, known that this gentle electrician had begun asking questions about the unsafe systems they had deliberately ignored in order to drain money from the project. Daniel had not merely been an accidental victim of a worksite tragedy. He had been a threat they wanted removed. The day he was ordered to climb up and repair the faulty wiring system had not been a random assignment, but a trap arranged by people who wanted to silence him forever and disguise it as an unfortunate workplace accident. And behind that deadly order, hidden beneath many layers of fronts and shields, was no one other than Viktorov Lang's network, the same network that had turned the contracting company into a tool for his filthy schemes. When Marin read those conclusions, she sat frozen for a very long time, both hands gripping Daniel's watch, and the tears she had held back for nearly 2 years finally rolled down her face. She cried not because she was surprised, because deep in her heart she had always felt that something had been hidden, but because her husband had finally been cleared, because the world would no longer see Daniel as a careless worker who had caused his own death, but would know him as a brave man who dared to stand against wrongdoing and paid for it with his life. That truth could not soothe the loss, but it returned to Daniel the most precious thing those people had once tried to steal from him, his honor and his innocence. The case quickly caused a shock. The authorities stepped in. The file on Daniel Caldwell's death was reopened, and this time, with evidence that could not be denied, no team of lawyers could twist the truth anymore. The people who had signed the order that sent him to his death were named one after another, and the company that had once moved freely beyond the reach of the law now had to face the punishment it deserved. Marin was invited in to formally receive the conclusion clearing her husband's name, and when she held in her hands the paper confirming that Daniel had been innocent, that he had been a victim and not the one at fault, she felt as if a heavy stone that had pressed down on her chest for years had finally been lifted away. Dorian stood quietly behind her in that moment, saying nothing, simply allowing her to have the fullness of the moment she had waited for far too long. He understood that this moment belonged to Marin and Daniel, a belated farewell between husband and wife, and that his silent presence was all she needed right then. When she stepped out of the public office building beneath a rare shaft of sunlight after so many rainy days, Marin lifted her face toward the sky and softly whispered a few words to her late husband, telling him that the truth had finally won, that he could rest now. In that moment, for the first time in nearly 2 years, her face relaxed into a peace she had thought she had lost forever, and beside her, Dorian watched in silence, his heart filled with a feeling he himself could hardly name, the feeling of a man who had helped reclaim one small part of what life had once stolen from them both. After everything had settled, one afternoon Dorian came to see Marin, and this time he didn't carry himself like a powerful boss, but simply like a friend paying a visit. He sat down across from her, and instead of offering help in the way that had once offended her, he chose another way, the way he had learned from her own precious stubbornness. He told her about Cora, about the younger sister with one leg that had never been whole, the sister he hadn't been able to save in time, and about the regret that had followed him for so many years. He said he understood why she didn't want to accept anyone's pity, because Cora had once been proud in exactly the same way. Then he gently said that he knew her leg could be treated, that there were skilled doctors who had helped many difficult cases others had given up on, doctors who might help her walk normally again, and that he had looked into it carefully. He didn't place money on the table, didn't speak of favors, but only said that he wanted to give her a chance, and that the decision to accept it or not was entirely hers. Marin was silent for a long time. Inside her, there was still the self-respect that had followed her all her life, the part of her that never wanted to owe anyone anything. But this time, when she looked into Dorian's eyes, she no longer saw the charity of the strong offered to the weak, but the sincerity of a man who had walked through the storm beside her, a man who had bled to protect the truth she had guarded. She realized that refusing him now was no longer about preserving her dignity, but only about being stubborn. True dignity, she came to understand, didn't lie in rejecting every hand held out to her, but in knowing how to tell the difference between pity and sincere respect. She quietly asked him why he was doing all of this for her, and Dorian answered that it wasn't because he thought she was pitiful, but because he believed she was worthy, that a woman who had held on to the truth and her dignity through so much suffering deserved the chance to move forward on 2 healthy feet. Those words touched Marin, because they didn't diminish her. They lifted her up. She nodded, and for the first time, she accepted help, not because she was weak, but because she had learned how to trust another human being. The surgery took place afterward, and the weeks of recovery were not an easy journey. Marin had to learn to walk all over again, had to be patient with every painful step, but she faced it all with the same strength that had helped her survive the darkest years of her life. Dorian never once did anything for her that she needed to do herself, because he understood that she needed to walk on her own. He only stayed quietly by her side, while Titan was always near her feet, like a loyal guardian. Then one morning, after so many days of effort, Marin stood up by herself and took her first steps without holding on to anything, the leg that had tormented her for so many years now able to support her steadily. She walked slowly toward the window, sunlight spilling over her face, and she broke down in tears. But this time, they were tears of joy, the tears of a person finally given back something life had once cruelly taken away. She turned to look at Dorian standing silently behind her, and in their eyes, without needing a single word, they both understood that they had walked through the darkness together and found the light. Many months had passed since that fateful night in the basement, and Marin's life had changed in a way she had never dared to dream of during her darkest years. She was no longer the silent shadow, kneeling to scrub floors in empty corridors in the middle of the night. No longer the widow carrying a heavy injustice in her heart with no one to tell. She walked steadily on her own 2 feet. And more important than anything, she had learned that opening her heart to trust another person wasn't a sign of weakness, but another kind of courage. The kind of courage that years of suffering had made her forget she once possessed. Dorian, too, was no longer the cold, solitary man standing at the peak of power, wearing a shell of steel every day to hide a deeply wounded heart. 2 people who had once known only how to survive alone in this world, who had built walls around themselves so no one could ever touch them, had now stopped carrying that loneliness by themselves because they had found in each other a place to lean on, and the strange thread that connected them, the thread that had begun on that rainy night, still moved faithfully around their feet, in the form of a huge, wrinkled dog with gentle brown eyes. Titan now lived peaceful days, no longer needing to guard against danger, needing only to lie in the sunlight by the threshold and watch over the 2 people it loved. On some afternoons, Marin would sit by the window, quietly take out the old watch with the cracked glass face, hold it in her palm for a long while, then smile and put it away again. The dog would lie beside her, resting its head on her knee, and she would gently stroke that wrinkled head, understanding that it had been the bridge that led her out of the darkness. Marin and Dorian's story did not end with some dazzling miracle, but with something far simpler. 2 wounded people healing each other through understanding and respect. And if there is one lesson left behind by everything that happened, it is that a person's true strength does not lie in power or money, does not lie in the ability to make others afraid, but in daring to use what one has to defend the vulnerable, to return justice to those who have been trampled, and to help a fallen person stand again without ever injuring their dignity. Kindness placed in the right hands can lift an entire life back to its feet, and sometimes the person most deserving of love is the very person the whole world has accidentally forgotten. Please remember that in this life, every human being, no matter how small or quiet they may seem, deserves to be seen, respected, and treated with kindness. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with those who need to be reminded that goodness still exists in this world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to many more meaningful and healing stories like this. How do you feel about Marin and Dorian's journey, and about the loyal dog that connected 2 destinies that seemed as though they would never meet? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings deep inside your heart, because we always hope to listen and walk alongside you. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story until the very last moments. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next stories.
Wrecked. Yeah. Mayhem. God. Thank you for the biddies. Ads don't even matter. Everyone's already subscribed. It's just a chat full of shrimp. 37 subs to level 16. Oh my god. Oh. Pamcha. Thank you for the follow. Welcome in. Welcome, yeah. Hi, friends. Oh my god. Sorry, there's a lot going on. I'm about to beat your last record. Keep up the support. That is crazy. It's nice when subscribers follow. Thank you for following, you guys. Anyone who's new here, who's been randomly gifted a sub, that's really loved. Sorry, you're welcome, legend. Oh, fucking thank you, Pam. You've heard of a sky full of stars. Now get ready for a chat full of shrimp. That second Brandy is following. Brandy,